Nickie Aiken.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Before I speak in this debate, may I take a moment to pay tribute and respect to Lord Peter Brooke of Sutton Manderfield, who has sadly passed away this weekend. For those of you who will know, he was a member of the Cities of London and Westminster for 25 years, from 1977 to 2001, and in that time was Cabinet Minister in the Thatcher and Major governments, Northern Ireland Secretary and Heritage Secretary. So I'd like to send my condolences to his widow Lindsay and the family. Madam Deputy Speaker, it is a privilege to speak in the second reading of the Victims and Prisoners Bill. Victims should and must have confidence in the criminal justice system, from making an allegation to the police investigation, court case, conviction, and all the way through to the parole stage. After all, we know that a victim's experience of the criminal justice system doesn't stop after the perpetrator has been found guilty. So I praise the Lord Chancellor, the Secretary of State and the Minister for listening to victims, survivors and their families and bringing forward this legislation which enshrines victims' rights into law. Quite rightly, Part 1 of the bill seeks to improve positive outcomes and provide that much needed support for victims at every level. As it currently stands, it does this by enshrining the key principles underpinning the Victims Code in law, simplifying support during and after the criminal justice system, strengthening the Victim Commissioner's role, and introducing a joint statutory duty on PCCs, integrated care boards and local authorities to work together when commissioning support services for victims of domestic abuse, sexual abuse and other serious violence. And of course all this is welcome. However, I would gently ask the Minister to consider what survivors like the broadcaster Charlie Webster, as well as the London Victims Commissioner Claire Waxman, are highlighting. Specifically their campaign to give teeth to the Victims Code, ensure there are proper resources in place for survivors and those supporting them. And the Minister will, of course, remember when he and I sat in Westminster City Council's Cabinet, he as in charge of adult social services, myself as children's social services, that governments are very good at providing local authorities with statutory duties, but it's very, very important that the funding comes with that statutory duty. And I think the Victims Bill will strengthen the divine rights to drive the cultural change needed to improve the treatment of victims in the criminal justice system. And I've read the letter that Charlie has written to the Secretary of State, which highlights the death of her very close friend Katie, the victim of sexual abuse. And I pay tribute to the work that Charlie has done in this arena. I first met Charlie, she's a constituent of mine, and we were both volunteering during the COVID pandemic, and she told me her experience as a victim of domestic abuse and sexual abuse, and I was very proud to sit on the Domestic Abuse Bill Committee and see through an amendment to the bill which Charlie had lobbied. And for those of you who know Charlie, she's very, very good at lobbying to ensure that children were included in as victims of domestic abuse. And Charlie's letter and Claire Waxman's campaign show that this kind of evidence-led legislation, which responds to the lived experience of victims and gives legally enforceable rights to justice and support. With their personal understanding, they know the needs and requirements to improve the system. And so I would ask if the Minister or the Secretary of State would meet with myself and Charlie to hear more about her own experience and her campaign, which makes some very astute recommendations regarding long-term funding for victim support services as the bill progresses through Parliament. Turning briefly to Part 2 of the bill, I think expanding provisions for support to those affected by major incidents is much welcome. And many colleagues in the chamber today have highlighted the experiences, or the horrendous experiences, of the Hillsborough victims and families. My constituency in the cities of London and Westminster has sadly through the years seen its own share of major incidents, from the 7/7 bombings, the 2017 Westminster Bridge terrorist attack, and most recently the 2021 Fishmongers Hall attack. Here, London has hundreds of victims, survivors and their families who have often felt left on the sidelines of support. And I found the testimony of many victims, particularly from the Manchester Arena bombing. We recently heard the public inquiry. I heard many of the testimonies from victims and surviving family members, very moving, and I pay tribute to their bravery. And I do hope that the bill reflects on this powerful testimony. So I have a great deal of sympathy for creating an independent and appropriate resourced advocate for victims of major incidents. And I say this because when a victim dies, the crime doesn't die with them. And often if the victim has been killed, it is their surviving family who continues a lifelong consequence of the perpetrator's actions. So it is incredibly important that when we consider victims, we consider the families too. The same principle applies when we consider parole. So turning to part 3 of the bill, which includes proposals to provide the Justice Secretary with powers regarding granting release to certain individuals that fall into the top tier of serious cases. Here I note in particular the honourable members for Birmingham Yardley and the right honourable members for South Swindon and for Witham support for Carrie Johnson in her campaign to prevent the killer of Joanna Simpson from being allowed his automatic release from prison after serving only half his sentence. Indeed, when looking to improve the parole board process, one group which must not be ignored is the victim's surviving family. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have been struck in researching this bill just how many families, like Joanna's mother, Diana Parks, and her children, have been neglected during the parole board process. And they should have more of a say, and I therefore welcome the bill's introduction that the right for families to apply to attend a parole hearing. And I'm very aware that this is a complex issue and one that is going to benefit from debate, but I believe we need to nuance this. After all, no one crime is the same, no one victim's experience is the same. So making sure that there is a sympathetic approach with appropriate powers in place for the Justice Secretary and the parole board so that they can deliver for all those affected by a top-tier crime is going to be critical to the success of this bill. That being said, Madam Deputy Speaker, as a whole, I certainly welcome this bill and, of course, the measures that will go to a significant way to change a victim's experience.